Welcome to debate number 20. How do we know what is true? Want to welcome the Backyard Skeptics. We want to thank the Huntington Beach Community Church for serving as our host, and the Christian Century Toastmasters are responsible for working with the Backyard Skeptics to formulate a question and then provide a dialogue and debate. And that's what we have tonight. It's my privilege to introduce, from my right to left, Mr. Wayne Gray. Sitting next to Wayne, also with the Backyard Skeptics, Mr. Kerry Cook. The third member of their panel, Mr. Paul Ritchie. I almost wanted to say the immortal Mike Bosworth, but he's still here. Mike Bosworth and David Lehman. The way debates run is one side gives a presentation, and then the other side will present an opposing view, or not. And then they'll go back and forth. We'll do that twice. Then we'll have rebuttals. And then we will have a time where individuals from the audience can ask questions of the debaters. Presenting first is Mr. Paul Ritchie for the Backyard Skeptics. I would like to just because I remembered, if you have cell phones, please silence them or put them on vibrate, in respect for the presenter.
Well, I thank you. Can you hear me in the back there?
Yes.
Is this clear enough? I want to thank everybody for inviting me here, especially Bruce. And I'll see what I can do here to clarify certain issues that I think relate to God and God's existence. So let me begin here by first talking a little bit about epistemology. Now, I'll try not to get too too much into the terminology of philosophy here. I am a philosopher, or at least I was. Epistemology is simply the study of knowledge, and how do we know, basically. Okay, there are a limited number of ways of knowing that men generally have agreed upon, men and women. So let me just briefly, and I'm not going to get into any of them in any great detail, but one of these I'm sure you're already familiar with, and this is the idea of sense perception. We know because we see, hear, and smell, and so on and so forth. And of course, science has made a great deal out of this, and that's the basis of science, is investigation through our senses and through whatever instrument science has developed over the millennia. Also, however, memory is another way of getting at truth and knowledge, but it is fallible, as everybody knows. But at any rate it is, but that's not going to relate much to what we have here tonight. And then, of course, there's a self-evident, or we call it a priori truth in philosophy. And this has to do with what we can know without any kind of sense perception at all. It's all in our heads, so to speak. Some people doubt that we have any of this, but that's another matter. For example, a circle must have a radius. Much of these a priori truths are matters of definition to begin with. Circle must have a radius. One cannot be older than one's biological mother. Two parallel lines cannot meet on a plane geometric surface, and that sort of thing. Direct perception of a supernatural being through some new kind of sense. This was promulgated by a philosopher by the name of William Alston. However, not too many people have taken that very seriously, and he's been heavily criticized. Through revelation of a sacred text, this also is not going to be very strong, because there are many sacred texts around the world, and how do we know which to choose from, especially if they all claim they have a true revelation? Once again, I'm not going to get into that. I think some of the debaters here tonight might get into that. Also, lastly and not least, I think, is through arguments. Setting up a particular argument, and if you have true premises, then the conclusion would have to be true. This is a method we use a lot in philosophy, of course. The theists have brought up many of these arguments themselves, like the fine-tuning argument, which you may have heard of. Okay, but what's, I think, important for us here tonight is to get a clear, it's important for me, you may have discussed this earlier, one of the other sessions, but we need to have a very clear definition of what we mean by a divine being, or in particular, in this case, the idea of God. And I'm going to just read from this book here by a professor of philosophy at Western University. And he defines God as a perfect, immutable, transcendent, non-physical, and I think that's an important characteristic. Omniscient. Omniscient means he knows everything here. Yeah. Omnipresent means he's always present. Personal, and he has a free will. He's all loving, all just, all merciful, and the creator of the universe. What I'm going to show later on, if I have the time, is that these characteristics cannot exist in one being. It's just impossible because there are too many contradictions for any kind of being that claims all of these different characteristics. All right, so much for that. I presume that's the kind of God we're going to be talking about this evening. If there's a different kind of God, then we're going to be all over the place and we're not going to make any progress at all. But this is the most interesting one and the most important one, as far as I'm concerned, at any rate. Now, how much time do we have left, incidentally? Is there
5 minutes, 4 minutes.
4? Oh, I got lots of time. Okay. All right, what I'm going to concentrate on here is to show that the concept of God is incoherent, which means that these characteristics cannot exist in the same being all at the same time. It simply doesn't make any sense. This is what we mean by incoherent. But incoherent has a more complicated meaning, and I just want to sketch that out very briefly. If something is incoherent, it's logically inconsistent. That means it contradicts itself. Like drawing a square circle. You can't draw a square circle. Not by the definitions given of what a square is and what a circle is. Or having a married bachelor. That won't go either. Or saying X and then saying not X in the same context. That's a no-no. Okay. The one that's most important for us here is stipulating 2 or more characteristics of an entity, that is something that exists, that contradict one another. For our purposes, this is the most important relating to God. For example, if God is all-powerful and all-merciful and just, why do we have so much pain, suffering, and evil in the world? This is the old problem of evil and suffering and so on. Now, this is not to say Christians don't have an answer to that. They do, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Why doesn't God eliminate this pain and suffering in the world? He should be able to do so if he is all-powerful. Okay, let's see if I got another example here. No, I don't have one, but I think you get the idea of that. Now, incoherence, however, could also be an act or a concept that is physically impossible or simply makes no sense at all from a physical point of view, such as jumping unaided to the moon. That would be an incoherent possibility. Nobody can do that, even with a spacesuit. Or another one, which is more important, I think, for our purposes, more interesting. It's impossible to know all there is to know in the world, all of reality. And the details of every atom in the world simply cannot be known. That's physically impossible to do for any being, not just for humans, but for any possible being. Or this being can't even know every grain of sand and what its characteristics are. Just think of the enormous amount of knowledge that would involve. Okay, so what I want to concentrate on are these incompatible. He has, Dr. Drange has a section that he wrote in this this magazine of Philo on incompatible proofs or properties of God. And these incompatible properties show that the God concept is incoherent. Now, there are dozens and dozens of these incoherencies in the concept of God, but we don't have time to go into all of these here. Let me give you an example, though, to begin with before I get into the book. If God knows ahead of time, since he is allegedly omniscient, that a certain individual will be a violent, evil person over his lifetime, and then at his death sentences him or her to an eternity of punishment in hell, this shows that God is not merciful and just. That's just a simple example. Now, of course, Christians have answers to this, but we'll say more about that later. It seems unjust to punish an individual for some 70 or 80 years of his life for an eternity in hell, which is supposed to be painful, at least so I've heard. Okay. 1 minute left. All right. Let me just give you a couple of others here from this book. Here, if I can do that. No, I lost my. My bookmark fell out of the book. So, oh dear. Taylor. Here we go. The perfection versus creation argument that theists often give. If God exists, then he's perfect. If he exists, then he's the creator of the universe. And a perfect being can have no needs or wants. If any being created the universe, then he must have had some need or want. Therefore, that's incoherent. How could you create the world unless you needed to create it? That's just one example. And second one here, the immutability versus the creation argument. If God exists, then he's immutable, which means he can't pass out of existence here. If he exists, then he's creator of the universe. And an immutable being cannot at one time have an intention and then at the later time not have the intention. So for any being to create anything prior to the creation, he must have had the intention to create it. But at a later time after the creation, no longer have the intention to create it. Once again, we have a self-contradiction. Therefore, you cannot have a God that's immutable. And I think my time has probably run out. Has it? Okay. Let the next speaker.
Thank you. And Bruce, I do have a timing device for the speakers.
Oh, yes.
Okay. So we'll go ahead and let the Christian side, Mike Bosworth or David Lehman.
You've got a mic over there.
Yeah, grab this one here. Paul raised so much stuff. Wow. Boy, we could talk about those things for days. This evening, I would like to find some common ground in a definition for truth. I want to examine the claim that Jesus is the truth, and I plan to differentiate between degrees of theological reflection, arriving at my understanding of what it means when Christians say that Jesus is the truth, and finally discover what our task is as theologians given such a claim. Let's see if we can arrive at a common ground for our understanding of truth. First of all, let me tell you, the truth is not simply whatever works for me. Truth is not what the majority says is true. Truth is not relative. Something is true when it corresponds with reality. Reality is what is. Reality is what is, regardless of the observer's perspective or desires or beliefs. Truth matches its objective. If this is our common understanding of truth, then to say that truth is relative is a misnomer. The statement is often made, all truth is relative. But is that a relative truth or an absolute truth? There's an inherent logical inconsistency with the statement. If someone says, you can't know the truth, you just can't know it, that statement also is self-defeating because it claims to know at least one truth, that you can't know any truths. In postmodern thought, truths are merely illusions. The truth is that no truth should be affirmed. that means that idea caves in on itself also. Finally, there's the notion that all truth claims are equally valid. But logic forbids, as Paul pointed out, that something can be both A and non-A at the same time. And most grievously inconsistent is that anything opposed to the truth must be false. Thus, the idea that all truth claims are equally valid denies itself. What I suggest to you is that when it comes to a working definition of truth, that the atheist and the agnostic, the skeptic, the humanist, the freethinker, and the religious will find common ground with this statement. When we declare something to be true or the truth, we're saying that our observation corresponds with reality. The degree of truthfulness found in our ideas and our principles and our statements is dictated by how closely they approximate reality. Now, is there such thing as absolute truth? Well, absolutely. The mathematician under the rubric of base 10 states that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Under no circumstance in doing math in base 10 can 2 plus 2 equal anything but 4, so we can confidently affirm that the statement is absolutely true. For mathematicians and all those practicing the hard sciences, absolute truths are empirically verifiable. Unfortunately, if we try to make the claim that science is the only source of absolute or objective truth, that statement can't be tested scientifically. Philosophically, I can affirm that absolute truth describes an inflexible reality. In other words, it is what it is. And when I tell it like it is, the statement is true. Now, Jesus makes an incredible claim concerning reality. When we turn to the Christian Bible, we find this exchange between Jesus and a Roman authority named Pilate. Jesus has been accused of civil disobedience, and Pilate asks, "You're a king then?" And Jesus answers, "You say I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." And then Pilate asks this question: what is truth? I think we now have an answer to Pilate's question. Truth is that which corresponds with reality. So Jesus says that he testifies to the truth, and if we substitute our common ground definition, we understand that Jesus' claims are a revealing of reality. While teaching his followers, Jesus made another bold statement. He said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." So not only is Jesus revealing reality, he says that he is reality. Now, what do we make of a claim like this? It certainly is beyond the realm of hard science to determine its factuality. Theologically, critical examination is what's called for. Theology examines truth claims about God and matters that are related to God to determine, as much as possible, if these claims are true or false. Now, what differentiates a good theologian from a poor theologian is the degree of reflection that they are equipped to conduct and actually perform. And so we have tabloid theologians who construct their theology based on hearsay information. We have folk theologians who uncritically and unreflectively construct their theology according to the traditions and religious folklore that they have been introduced to. We have lay theologians. They build their theology through personal research. Though this person hasn't been formally trained in the science of biblical research, nevertheless they are critically thinking about what and why they believe certain religious propositions. Ministerial theologians are persons who have been formally educated in some sort of theological methodology. They're fully trained in the use of tools and resources necessary to conduct scholarly biblical research. These tools include like a working knowledge of biblical languages, knowing how to do grammatical, historical exegesis, critical thinking, and the like. This person has acquired the ability to critique religious propositions so that there can be a theological integration of thought. And the fruit of that endeavor is to be passed on to others in order to guide them on their own spiritual journeys. You might say that the ministerial theologian is a general practitioner. Then we have the professional theologian. They're, through more intense education, are equipped to teach ministerial theologians. They usually have concentrated their study to a specific area of practical theology and reached in what we call the doctorate in philosophy, the PhD. So professional theologians are like the specialists. And then we have academic theologians, and they're the theoretical researchers engaging in this highly speculative and philosophical religious concepts. And it's from the ivory towers that they give professional theologians something to think about. Now, I consider myself a ministerial theologian. So from this level of theological reflection, I can say to you that Jesus is the superseding revelation of the Creator. That's his claim. Jesus doesn't claim to reveal the truth in any scientific realm of investigation. To the best of human capability, Jesus testifies to the reality commonly referred to as God. Now, not only does God tell us the truth, not only does Jesus tell us the truth about God, Jesus also shares absolute identification with the truth. He says, I am the truth and I testify to the truth. So the truth about God is not found in a list of his attributes that sometimes are apparently contradictory, not found in prepositions or axioms, not in creeds or doctrines or confessions, not in the notions of tabloid folk or lay theologians, and unfortunately not in many so-called preachers or pastors, but rather truth is found in your personal encounter with the one who is the truth of God. Theological truth is found in Jesus. Now, when we study theology, we're told that everyone is a theologian. Anyone who asks ultimate questions is a theologian. Why am I here? What's life? Is there meaning to life? What happens after death? Is there God? Theology critically examines claims about God to determine their truth or falsity. Each of us must determine if the claims of Jesus, his testimony of the truth, that he is the truth, correspond with reality or not. That's our task as theologians as we consider the ultimate question of life. Is what Jesus reveals truth?
Okay, Dave, cut me off at 7 minutes, please. I don't want to go over. Okay, the name of this debate is How Do We Know What's True? I outlined that entire issue last time, but my outline went ignored because everybody wanted to talk about the same old God question. So if that's the only part that people want to talk about, I might as well join you. So can we know if there's a God? If so, how? Okay, I claim to know a personal supreme being exists because I buy transcendental argument for God, acronym TAG. Atheists don't buy TAG, mostly because they lump it together with presuppositionalism, and presuppositionalism is crazy. Now, the version I agree with, the version of TAG, says that logic is eternal and cannot exist apart from a mind. Therefore, an eternal mind must exist. The atheists contend that logic is just the way physical reality is. So, it's either supreme being theory or just the way it is theory. End of argument. Dave Lehman claims to know there's a God because of the astronomical odds against life happening otherwise. Atheists don't buy that because an infinite multiverse may exist in which anything that's possible necessarily happens. But let's say this universe is all there is, and Dave's argument is perfectly sound. That would only prove that a creator of this universe exists. Jumping from there to God of the Bible is totally unsupported. If Dave wants to contend that messianic prophecies prove Bible God, let him list those prophecies prior to debate, and we can pick them apart one at a time. Can the God of the Bible be proven one way or another? Well, if Bible God is omnipotent, but he can't lie, then he is logically contradictory and therefore cannot exist. But pay attention here. A God who inspired the Bible can exist. He cannot have inspired the Bible the way most Christians say he did, like a music composer who dictates every note, but a God may have inspired the Bible like the owner of a magazine or newspaper inspires his workers to push his agenda, but doesn't care enough to approve everything that goes out, because his purpose is accomplished without that much effort, possibly even better. This way, he can't be held accountable for all the sales hype, all the things the kids need to believe, but the adults don't, such as God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent. A casual glance at this world should be sufficient to convince any sensible mind that it wasn't created by anything like that. If the heavens declare the glory of God, the earth certainly declares his limitations. If you affirm the first but deny the second, you are delusional or lying. Furthermore, if this planet was created by any kind of God, it looks like it was left under the supervision of a bunch of bungling subordinates. Maybe God or those subordinates had a hand in the Bible, or maybe the Bible evolved naturally without any intervention whatsoever, simply because most people want a Bible to justify their existence. Want a God to justify their existence. But there's another question that's more important than any of this. Can you know if a God exists to whom you're ultimately accountable? No. You can, however, make the most informed guess by becoming the most informed person you can be. By informed, I don't mean by reading what other people have said and written. We all know that other people are stupid liars. I mean by experimenting with the reality you live in. If you believe some particular thing, act in accordance with what you believe for the purpose of testing it. If you do, you'll find out if it's true, if it's worded solidly enough to be proven true or false. If not, you'll still find out what happens to a person who acts on that belief. And you will find out if you still believe it after you know where it leads. If you don't act in accordance with what you believe, you may go through your entire life believing serious errors that could have been disproven if you had not been such a spiritual wimp. But then you Bible believers have an out. Deuteronomy 6:16 says, don't test God. But then Malachi 3:10 says, do test God, concerning the promises on payoff on tithing. So what's going on? Well, Deuteronomy says, don't test him like the Hebrews did at Massa. That's where they challenged Moses for leading them out into the desert where they didn't have any water. So apparently, if you have money, then give a tenth of it to God on the promise of reward. But if that doesn't work and you go broke, then shut the hell up, even if you run out of water. If a product test does not get the promised result, what failed? The test, the promiser, or the product? Figure it out. Jesus allegedly made some promises worth testing. Mark 10:30. Followers of Jesus will receive 100-fold reward in this life. A lot of rich Christians say that works. Didn't work for me, so apparently they followed Jesus better than I did. John 7:17. If any man will do God's will, he will know if Jesus' teaching is of God or not. That one really impressed me as a young Christian. I really wanted to know, so I did it to the best of my ability. I was reduced to living in my car while working for Trinity Broadcasting Network. It caused me so much stress that it wrecked my nerves, and I still haven't recovered. Okay, what about you atheists? What can you test? Well, first off, you can't know. Even if all earthly scripture is total crap, there may still be a God to whom humans are accountable. Though you cannot know the answer, you can be sufficiently convinced to place a bet one way or the other. In fact, you already have. You bet against. But those of you who are worth talking to are still open to new evidence. So with this in mind, I have proposed a test, a prayer test. It's posted on my website, sanityquest.com. This is a prayer test for atheists. God to whom I'm accountable, it is my opinion that you do not exist. Therefore, if you exist, I charge you to prove at least the probability of it to my satisfaction by any means at your disposal. Furthermore, even if you exist, it is my opinion that you do not have the power to correct errors, even when such correction is asked for. So if you have such power, correct this error by any means at your disposal. Furthermore, if you fail to do so, I will cite this prayer test as evidence of your non-existence or impotence, and tell anyone whom I choose of the results I have found. End of prayer. That's 7? Okay.
Did you want to go?
Lehman.
He's only gone 7 out of the time that he came, so.
Well, you want to alternate? You want Dave Lehman to go?
we could.
Doesn't
matter, whatever.
You're up.
Because once he starts.
Okay. Well, to get a true picture, I think we have to look at where we're at. And as I've told people before, as I look around and I see the animals, the trees, the flowers, the sun, the moon, the stars, the people, I can know something about the Creator, God, from just my environment. This is what we call natural revelation, the things of nature. But for answers to questions like, who am I? Am I just an intelligent animal, or do I have a soul? What about life after death? How should I use my time and my talents? And what does he require from me? I need some kind of special revelation couched in human language that I can understand. And the question is, where's that information found, and how can I be sure that it's from God? God has given us several insights into his word. For example, he says, since the creation of the world, his invisible power and attributes are clearly seen by the things that are made, so that they are without excuse. Romans 1:20, that seeing they may see and not perceive, and hearing they may not hear. They may hear and not understand, lest at any time they should be converted, and their sins be forgiven them. So understanding seems to be important as far as conversion. And so anybody that seeks to know him, he that comes to him, he will in no wise cast out. So at Deuteronomy 4:29, he that seeks me with his whole heart will find me. So God has promised that no matter what background a person is coming from, no matter what religious background or country or how remote he is, if he's truly seeking God, God's going to reveal himself to him. But if a person is, he says, I will choose the delusions of them that hate me. So just rejecting God, that's Isaiah 66:4. We understand that that's one of the judgments of God for rejecting him is lack of understanding. He gives wisdom to the upright. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding to those that are pleasing in his sight. He gives wisdom, knowledge, and joy. So one of the rewards for seeking God with a pure heart is that God gives them understanding, wisdom. We look at the Bible and the writers of the Bible, they had a lot of foreknowledge of things that they would not have known in any other way unless God revealed it to them. For example, the earth floats in free space, Job 26:7, affected only by gravity, while other sources declare the earth sat on the back of an elephant or a turtle or was held up by Atlas. The Bible alone states that he hangs the earth on nothing. The Bible specifies the perfect dimensions for the stable water vessel in Genesis 6:15. In other words, 4,500 years ago, God told Noah how to build an ark. Sanitary industry was birthed in Deuteronomy 23. Some 3,500 years ago, God commanded his people to have a place outside the camp where they could bury their human waste. And of course, up until World War I, more soldiers died from disease than war because they didn't isolate their human waste. Oceans contain springs in Job 38:16. The ocean is very deep. It's almost impossible for anybody to know that until the 1970s with the help of deep diving research. Submarines, they were constructed to withstand 6,000 pounds per square inch of pressure. And of course, oceanographers discovered springs on the ocean floors. And our bodies are made up of things of the dust of the ground, Genesis 2:7. Scientists have discovered that the human body is comprised of some 28 base and trace elements, all of which are found on the earth. Science confirms the Bible throughout. Colossians 2:3. These insights place the Bible far above every man-made theory and above all so-called inspired books. In contrast, we look at the Quran, we see the sun sets in a muddy pool surrounded by a bunch of people. The Hadith tells us all kinds of things. Book of Mormon tells us that Native Americans descended from the Jews, which has been disproven. So the problem is that we have gone into a postmodern environment. I used to debate a postmodernist at Oxford, and this was interesting. It was like trying to nail Jello on a wall because he didn't believe in truth. So I looked at the summary of worldviews. How do we know what's true? Well, a secular humanist is basing everything on what he can see and observe. This is a rationalist. He's pretty much determining if I can understand it, I have to be able to experimentally repeat that. And of course, it's totally based on science or the idea of empirical observation. Postmodernist doesn't really believe in truth, and so we can see all of their views line up pretty much. The one that's different is the biblical Christian theism, because he has revealed truth. He has the Bible. And so all three of these, atheism, pantheism. Of course, pantheism is simply if God is everything, then he's nothing in particular, so it's a subtle form of atheism. We got philosophy, naturalism, dialectical materialism, or some kind of mystical monism. Everything is one. We see ethics, basically relativism versus absolute standards. The biology, we see evolution versus creation. Psychology, we see various forms of transcendentalism, behavior modification, behaviorism, and self-actualization, of course, in the secular humanist branch. In sociology, we see basically feminism, abortion, same-sex marriage, as opposed to the strong families. In various forms of truth, we see trying to reason, or postmodern would say no objective truth, or cosmic humanism would say subjective truth. But every single thing here is that man seems to be, without his ability to reason logically to the wrong conclusion, seems to be what we see here. Because without God's revelation, he's going to come to something, that is not true, at least not true according to the biblical standard. So we can look at their attempts at finding the truth about all these different subjects, as opposed to what the Bible, it is not in man to direct his steps. And so we see the politics is basically globalism, which is what we see happening in the world today. Globalism doesn't work. I mean, we can't even control a city. We have all kinds of problems, and then we go to the larger areas for state, and then government, and then globalism. It's impossible to manage. So that's why we want individual local control. Most conservatives do, because it's much more efficient. And of course, as opposed to history, they see a historical evolution, constructivism versus a cyclical attitude of reincarnation and samsara. Religious pluralism is the belief that one must be tolerant of all religions because there is no religion that can be true. Postmoderns believe skepticism of absolute truth, skepticism of a discernible foundation for knowledge, and skepticism of all meta-narratives, which is how we define reality, any story. In our postmodern climate, where truth is denied, religious claims are based on preference rather than objective standards. Either you prefer the notion of the existence of God or you do not. Either you like the idea of Jesus being Savior or you do not. Either you like miracles appeal to you or they do not. As Richard Rorty, truth is whatever his community of scholars allows him to get away with. So if he thinks the moon should be made of green cheese and his community doesn't disagree with it, for him, the moon is made of green cheese. Reality is not what exists, but reality is what is produced by our agreement of what it is. We don't discover truth, we simply create it. That's the concept of postmodernism. In the Enlightenment, we placed faith in rationalism, which taught the idea truth is knowable by unaided intellect of the sincere truth seeker. Revelation wasn't needed. Reason and science could provide the answers. Truth, not revealed by God, but self-evident to the reasoning mind. That was the hallmark of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment came out of the result of the fact that Martin Luther questioned the church. He didn't think the church, this 95 Theses, all of them had to do with selling salvation, and he was correct on that. But instead of rejecting just the abuses of truth, they simply threw the whole thing out, and so they rejected God's Bible, the Bible too. Enlightenment placed this truth. So now, in rationalism, but rationalism, the Enlightenment, as Ian Murray tells us, is a use of the mind which trusts in its own ability to arrive at truth about God without his aid, and apart from revelation, it treats the mind as the source of knowledge rather than a channel. So I look at the Bible as got to be inerrant. It ought to be inerrant in the area that talks about its own inerrancy, And of course, 3,408 times in the Bible, it claims to be the Word of God. Thus saith the Lord spoke, saying, you accepted these not as the words of man, but for what they really are, the Word of God. And what the Bible teaches is true without a single error in the original manuscripts. Inerrancy must apply equally to all parts of the Scripture. Inerrancy requires the proper application of hermeneutics. The writer may intend to record an error or lie that someone says, but we need to look at what the Bible says is the case. There is no God. It does say that, but it says the fool has said in his heart there is no God. So what test would you give any body of literature to judge whether it's true or whether it's from God? Well, the 4 tests that I give are inspiration, inerrancy, preservation, and illumination. The Bible is unique in so many ways. It's unique and read by more people and published in more languages than any other book. There have been more copies produced of its entirety and more portions and selections than any other book in history. It's unique in its translation. It's been translated and retranslated and paraphrased more than any other book in existence. Christianity was a missionary religion. They wanted to get this message out because they believed that it was something people needed to hear, so they immediately started translating it. The Bible, however, gives a challenge to all the other religious writings. Behold, the former things come to pass, the new things I declare. Before they sprung forth, I tell you them. I believe that God is looking up. He's above the parade. He can see the end from the beginning, as one of our members here said, that God would be held accountable for knowing something and then not doing anything about it. But God is actually aware of this, but he doesn't have to interfere with it. He can allow us to make decisions and allow us to make mistakes. He can give us insight. He can send people to us to help us to send missionaries out, send people to talk to us. Anybody that seeks him is going to find him. And so anybody that's truly seeking God, God will reveal himself to them in ways that he brings people to them to help them to understand. In Isaiah 46:9, he also says, remember the former things of old, I am God, for there is none else. I am God, there is none else like me, declaring the end from the beginning, from the ancient times, the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure.
Your time has expired. I'm going to put like 5 minutes up for your...
5 minutes for me will
Already.
be enough. Mark? Yeah, okay. Will you also, will someone be kind enough to pass these out? Thank you.
On the sideline, it's probably going to be better.
Sorry about that.
It was roughly 35 years ago that I had a tract made. It was a Christian tract, and it represented my knowledge that Jesus was real because of Messianic prophecy. Will you get those passed out here? Yeah, okay. I put it under windshield wipers. I handed it out to friends. I distributed it in the neighborhood. But I've come to a different conclusion now. I spent over 50 years as a Christian and am something different now. So what's this business about Texas being covered with silver dollars? I was hoping, David, that you would bring that up tonight, but you didn't. I've heard him use this before. This scenario is based on how Jesus fulfilled Messianic prophecy. For example, one claimed prophecy is that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Well, of the earth's population in Jesus' day, only 1 in 300,000 persons was born in Bethlehem, maybe, so that makes 1 in 300,000 odds. And then, if additional prophecies are multiplied with that 1 in 300,000, the odds become fantastically impossible. So, someone has analogized that it becomes the equivalent of Texas, covered 2 feet deep with silver dollars, with one coin hidden there somewhere, with a Sharpie mark on it indicating Messiah. Now, a blindfolded man with hemorrhoids has but one choice to find the Messiah coin. Not so fast. Let's look at this business about prophecy. A Bethlehem birth. Micah 5:2. But you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler. Matthew 2 claims that Jesus' birth in Bethlehem fulfills this prophecy. However, Micah's Bethlehem Ephrathah is not a town, but a clan, the clan of Bethlehem, of Caleb's wife. Ephrathah was her name. You can find it in 1 Chronicles 2:50. You can find it in 1 Chronicles 4:4. What's wrong with Matthew's prophecy is that the quote is incomplete. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, leaves out both Ephrathah, leaves out clan. This makes the verse look as though it could be about a town called Bethlehem, rather than the known family clan. But Micah 5:6 gives the real subject anyway, a military leader who will defeat the Assyrians. So why pretend this is about Jesus? The born in Bethlehem prophecy failed. Another prophecy is about 30 pieces of silver. Matthew 27:9 quotes Jeremiah concerning 30 pieces of silver, the payment to Judas for betrayal. Jeremiah didn't even write it. 30 pieces of silver is found in Zechariah, not Jeremiah. If it is agreeable to you, give me my wages, and if not, refrain. So they weighed out for my wages 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter. That princely price they set on me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord for the potter. Then I cut into my other staff bonds that I might break the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. Zechariah 11. Whether this is a story about a shepherd who was shortchanged, or the Exodus 21 discounted price of a gorged slave, or a guy with an extra staff who obeys the Lord, it's very questionable to link this to Judas. And it seems that the guiding Holy Spirit should have helped the Matthew writer identify Zechariah as the scripture he was quoting. Matthew 27 has Judas returning the money and hanging himself. Luke, on the other hand, in Acts 1, mentions only a payment with which Judas bought a field, where he then falls and is disemboweled. These stories are significantly different. Oh, my time is, this is a killer. Okay, Nazareth. Matthew 2:23 says, the prophets had foretold that Jesus would be called a Nazarene. There is some English confusion between Nazareth maybe and the Nazarite vow, but this shouldn't have been the case with Greek and Hebrew. But no Old Testament passage even mentions the city of Nazareth, so that prophecy, did it exist? How about the, I'm over time. Give me some more. Matthew 2:15 claims that the flight of Jesus' family to Egypt is a fulfillment of Hosea 11:1. When Israel was a child, then I loved him. I called my son out of Egypt. But Hosea was not prophesying. That's the historical reference to the Exodus, not to Jesus. I'm getting the impression that this writer is sneaky. He shortened the Testament, the Old Testament quote to read, out of Egypt I have called my son. He eliminated Israel. This never was prophecy. Herod's slaughter, Matthew 2:17, quotes Jeremiah 31:15. You got it right this time. Claiming it to be the prophecy of Herod's slaughter of boys in and around Bethlehem after the birth of Jesus. However, Jeremiah's very next two verses show this passage is not about Jesus, not about Herod. It's about a Babylonian captivity. Do you remember your first pony ride? It can be a beautiful thing. The Mark writer tells a beautiful story about Jesus. Mark 9 has a story about Jesus riding on a colt, Palm Sunday, triumphal entry. The Matthew writer tried to tie this prophecy to prophecy. Matthew 21:4 refers to Zechariah 9, where a king rides a donkey. And now it gets funny. That Zechariah passage also includes the land of Hadrach, Damascus, all tribes of Israel, Hamath, Tyre and Sidon, silver like dust, gold like the dirt of streets, destruction of sea power, Gaza losing a king, Ashkelon being deserted, mongrels in Ashdod, ending Philistine pride, blood from mouths, forbidden food from teeth, formation of a clan in Judah, Ekron to be as Jebusites, guarding against marauding forces, everlasting protection from oppressors, chariots from Ephraim, war horses from Jerusalem, a battle bow, proclaiming peace to the nations, rule extending from sea to sea, prisoners of a waterless pit, a fortress for prisoners of hope, bending Judah as a bow, rousing of Zion's sons against other sons, and making God's chosen into a warrior sword. Are we to ignore this huge jumble list of Zechariah references? Are we to accept that since a donkey ride was in there somewhere, that Zechariah prophesied of Jesus? That is ridiculous. I'm going to stop there, but there is more.
want the rebuttal to be on the Christian side?
Sure. Yep. 15 minutes total for rebuttal for each side. So between the two or the three panelists, and the Christian sides can go first.
My colleagues have raised a lot of good issues, a lot of good questions. Remember when I talked about there's different degrees of theological reflection? All of their arguments are raised at the lay theological level. And as such, they are not privy to the higher criticisms and understanding of the Bible and biblical research. And so there's a lot of easily misunderstood things within Scripture that require an enormous amount of study to truly get to what is being said. What Wayne just shared with you about prophecy, Christianity is not lockstepped. There is huge variety of thought. Wayne might be surprised to find that what he said, there's Christian theologians who heartily agree with him, that are still believers. And there's others who would say, no, as Dave Lehman shares, this prophecy is proof of the Scriptures. But again, what I want to try to show you or to let you know is that levels of understanding determine a lot of what we decide is to be true or not true about Jesus and about the Bible and about God. And I think the more trained you become in a field, the better equipped you are to deal with these apparent inconsistencies. I think it was Paul raised about the attributes of God, omniscient and omnipresent and all-powerful and immutable. And when you look at the theological history of where these terms come from, you start to understand their relevance and what was trying to be communicated by those that purported it. Now, what happens a lot of times is these ideas get picked up as by lay theologians without any understanding of what went into their statements or how they got to those confessions of faith. And thus they seem apparently contradictory when we subject them to what we might say logical incoherencies. Thank you. Yes. And they seem to be logically incoherent. But when we look at them from the proper perspective, we see that they are not incoherent. One of the things that I differ with David so much is our understanding of inspiration of Scripture. We have a difference in understanding of what infallibility means. We have a difference in understanding how God is sovereign. Yet our differences, we could stand here and argue them back and forth, debate them and discuss them, and yet both of us would claim that we believe in God. The God is revealed in Scripture. And we would both be correct. That we are both believers. We just have different theological viewpoints. So what I'm saying is a lot of times what I find is that most confusion about Scripture and how it relates to us comes from a lay theological perspective and often is perpetuated by preachers and pastors who should know better but teach error instead. David?
Well, I would like to go through every one of those if we had time, but the first one, Matthew 5:2, is very clearly a picture of the Messiah. For one thing, the Hebrew expression, whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. That's the Micah 5:2, yeah. Did I say Matthew? I'm sorry. Micah 5:2. But that is the strongest Hebrew expression for eternity. And that's the only one person whose goings forth have been from eternity. That means self-existent. That can only be referring to the Messiah. We can go right through the 30 pieces of silver quoted from Jeremiah, also from Zechariah. That there's nothing wrong with that. The New Testament writers many times did quote from one passage which really referred to another passage, so that's not a problem. But I would like to continue on where I was going, was just to kind of look at the very testimony that God makes for his creation, knowing that we have evidence that nobody can dispute. God wanted to make sure that there was not going to be any atheists out there who could be atheists for good reasons. They can have intellectual excuses, but they cannot have an intellectual reason. And the reason I say that, I'm very intelligent people here, I'm not questioning that, but I am saying that sometimes we, for one reason or another, because we're angry at God or something, that we want to show that anger by denying his existence. That's about the only way I can get even with God, I think. So that's probably part of it. But let's turn to slide 37. And I just like to look at the origin of life itself, because it's something, where did life come from? And, the whole concept that they have no answer for. Proteins depend on DNA for their formation, but DNA cannot form or therefore exist without 75 pre-existing proteins. Carl Sagan called this a biological treadmill. Amino acids can be right-handed or left-handed, but because of their tertiary structure or three-dimensional folding, they're almost always left-handed. Otherwise, they wouldn't fold properly. There can be between 50 and 50,000 amino acids in a single protein molecule. We look at milk, for example. I mean, it's tremendously complex. And the probability of just getting, the simplest form of reproducing form of life, both sufficient DNA to code 124 proteins and sufficient protein to house and catalyze DNA, independently evolved and subsequently associated together to form the first living entity, would be the probability of 1 over 10 to the 89,190th power, the probability of forming specific DNA, times 1 over 10 to the 78,436 power, the probability of forming 124 specific proteins, which means it'd be 1 over 10 to the 167,626 power, assuming a million Earths around every star in the universe and every molecule in the oceans of these Earths was an amino acid trying to form a protein or a nucleotide from a DNA. Now, this would be every second for 10 billion years. This is what Dr. Moritz, theoretical smallest organism, in reality, even simple bacterium, the common intestinal inhabitant of man and animal, contains 3 million DNA base pairs. So this is just a typical example of what we're dealing with, DNA and RNA. The process itself is extremely complex, but let me go to something else because, just a simple biochemistry of a single human cell is so tremendously complex. And then not only do you have to get the proteins and the DNA and the protein molecules together, but you have to get a membrane-encased, self-repairing, self-duplicating, metabolizing living cell, and that's a jump in complexity that nobody's even able to theoretically come up with. And then we look at the human eye, and this is something that Darwin had a problem with, but it's like, what is the human eye? The idea of creating this out of random processes without a divine creator seems almost impossible. One fellow, as I've mentioned before, said, what is the probability of just, the photoreceptor cells in the back of the eye, each one can perform the equivalent of 500 nonlinear simultaneous differential equations 100 times a millisecond. So when you consider there's 10 million of them interacting with each other in complex ways, it would take a cray supercomputer over 100 years to simulate what takes place in the back of your eye many times every second. And then I go through and look at the windshield, the wipers and washers. Our eyes are not only, to protect our eyes, but to cover them. Whether we sleep or blink, this has to be continuous. If we don't, we'd go blind. You don't have that constant saturation of the eye. And if you close your eye, you'll notice a very small opening in the marginal upper and lower eyelids near the nose. These holes are called puncta, and they're attached to pumps that remove the tear fluid as it flows across the eye to drain it into the nose. And of course, eye is a tremendous complex thing. Now, the muscles in the eye are such tremendous insight. These muscles will keep the eye focused, and both eyes focused on the same spot. It's like having two pistols and shoot at the bullseye and both of them hit, no matter what you do. We don't generally think of the eye as a muscular organ, but it's some of the busiest muscles in the body. There are two sets of muscles inside the eye. One set opens and closes the iris diaphragm, admitting different amounts of light. The second muscle is attached to strings to the perimeter of the lens and changes its shape during focusing. There's all the three pairs of muscles attached to the outside of the eye. These muscles rotate the eyeball so that we can look in different directions without moving our heads. Here's just the whole basic pair of muscles work like reins on a horse to aim the eye to the right and to the left, but they have to be in sync. And the third set of muscles rotates the eye like a doorknob, and the eye is continually wiggling, so it actually will determine what, if it wasn't doing that, we wouldn't be able to see something unless it was moving. So, this is just too complex to explain in detail, but this is what God has created. Scientific American says that generations of creationists have tried to counter Darwin by citing an example of the eye as a structure that could not have evolved. The eye's ability to provide vision depends on the perfect arrangement of its parts. The critics say natural selection could never favor the transitional forms needed during the eye's evolution. What good is half an eye? And anticipating this criticism, Darwin suggested that an incomplete eye might confer benefits, such as being able to sense light. The problem is, just a light-sensitive spot is so tremendously complex. Dan Nilsson from PBS tried to convince us that the eye could easily have evolved through a computer simulation. First, the eye-sensitive layer bends gradually into a cup so it can tell the direction of the light rays increasingly well. This continues until the curved into a hemisphere filled with transparent substance. However, even a simple light-sensitive spot requires a dazzling array of biochemical processes in the right place and the right time to function. When light first strikes the retina, a photon interacts with a molecule which arranges within picoseconds to transretinal. That's 1/10 to the minus 12 seconds. A picosecond is the amount of time that it takes light to travel the breadth of a single human hair. The change in the shape of the retinal molecule forces a change into the shape of the protein rhodopsin, to which this retinal is tightly bound. I mean, I'm not even going to be able to begin to explain how complex this is. This is just to get some kind of light-sensitive material.
Is there no time limitation on this?
Yes, it's 15 minutes.
15 minutes total?
Okay, so I'm not going to continue. But just the whole idea is so tremendously complex. I can't imagine how anybody could imagine this happened by chance. The ear is even at least as complex as the eye. The eardrum itself can sense air pressure 1/30,000th of an inch of atmospheric pressure. That's like standing on a piece of paper. That would be much more than a 30,000th of an inch. Yet it has red corpuscles going through it that are 60,000 times that diameter. The eardrum can sense 1/10 the diameter of a hydrogen atom movement. It has three bones, so it goes from air to a solid. Those three, the hammer, staples, the hammer, the anvil, and the stapes, those three actually amplify at 120 decibels, which is huge. Then the stapes goes into this fluid called cochlear duct, and has three different compartments in it. And there are about 16,000 of these hair cells and millions of the hair bundles. These are little hair follicles that, as the fluid is going through the cochlear duct, it will cause pressure, and that pressure moves a little diaphragm, and as the diaphragm moves, it moves this tectoral membrane, it wiggles it, and these inner hair cells, there's millions of them, they actually open or close a trap door up
David,
to 20,000 times a second.
I am going to have to call for the time
Okay.
for the rebuttal. It was supposed to be 15 minutes, and we've gone over on that.
Is it? Okay.
So we'll allow them 17 minutes on any combination of the presentation of your panel. As we continue.
Yeah, let me start here. I didn't know we were going to get into creationist arguments here, but let me start with some of the things that were said earlier here. Is this working, this microphone? Yeah. Somebody pointed out here that without God's revelation, then nothing would make sense. That seems to me to be a perfectly circular argument. How do you know that? What about all the other sacred texts around the world? If they said the same thing, then who are we to believe? This is totally a Christian bit of nonsense, it seems to me. I don't even know why they bring that sort of thing out. Believe in God because we like the concept? I thought I heard that somewhere too. That's the old pragmatic argument. But pragmatism was not one of the things we agreed on here. And incidentally, I agree with with one of the Christian commentators here that the best sort of definition of truth is simply agreeing with reality. I will certainly go along with that. The problem is, how do you do that? You have to justify it. And there are only so many ways you can justify it, and I pointed those out very early, they were soon forgotten, apparently. Ultimate truth? What on earth does that mean? First of all, true is an adjective. Truth is a noun. How do you switch from one to the other? I talked about being incoherent. This is a perfect example of that. How do you just jump from a noun, an adjective to a noun? What does it mean by ultimate truth? That doesn't make any sense to me at all. Another incoherent. I wish he could have explained that in more detail. Inspiration, the test of the truth of the Bible, Old and New Testaments, I presume, is inspiration, the number of those who read the Bible, the number of Christians around the world, and that's true, they are the most numerous. It seems to me, though, that they're the ones that have been most easily brainwashed by wealthy Western countries with all their Bibles and whatnot. They're even infiltrating China now, I understand. That proves nothing, absolutely nothing. People are inspired by all kinds of religions and by various kinds of philosophies as well. How come it doesn't prove their truth of that particular religion or philosophy? How can people get away with that kind of nonsense in claiming that inspiration is one of the proofs of Christian revelation? Oh boy. One more thing here, if I've got time. I can find it here. Yeah, if you seek God, you will find him. And that is a very interesting claim, because when I first went into the military with my Bible under my arm, which was that of Spinoza, people didn't quite understand what this was. But one of my Christian friends said, well, look, just kneel down and ask God if he's really there and so on, and you'll get to know them. He'll tell you. And I said, but if I did that, that already commits me to your religion. I couldn't think of a more stupid thing to say to me. I felt like saying to him, get on your knees and read Spinoza's work and you'll be convinced too. Unfortunately, he didn't take me up on that. I have read part of the Bible, but it was so boring, I decided to give it up. I had better things to do. I didn't want to get into the evolutionary part of this here, but some of my colleagues here on my left, some of the so-called atheists, seem to bother me almost as much as my theist friends over here. For example, he talked about accountability. Why should we have an accountability to God? First of all, I wasn't even here when the Bible started there. Why should I be accountable? And what does it mean to be accountable? Is that like a child being accountable to his parents? Or an employee being accountable to his employer? Accountability is just a word, and it's a rather vague one at that. Besides, why should I be accountable? And what if there's no God? What a waste of time to be accountable to a God that doesn't exist. So there are all kinds of problems I see here with my colleagues here, both theists and semi-theists. Do I have more time? Yep. Oh, 30 seconds. I don't know if I can. Oh, I wanted to give one more idea of an incoherence. God is supposed to know everything. Now, everything means all the atoms and molecules in the world. Somebody estimated there's something like 10 to the 50th power of atoms in the world. How could God possibly know that? Know what each one is doing, where it is, etc., etc. That is totally physically impossible. More importantly, God doesn't have any physical means of keeping this knowledge, even if he had it. How is he going to do that? All the knowledge we know of is in computers, books, various sorts of material things. But God is not material. Another incoherent. How could he possibly know that if he doesn't even have a body? And not only that, but he's supposed to be infinitely, have an infinite amount of energy. He created the world. Well, energy implies, by Einstein's very famous formula, M equals mc squared, that God has energy, and that, of course, he has mass. Where is God? I'll end with that.
Your side has a remainder of 11 minutes. So between the two other people in the panel.
Oh, okay. Well, if there's more time, I'll finish up where I left off.
All right.
Okay. I left off with the end of my prayer test. Let me do it. I left off with the end of my prayer test. Okay, now that is a fair test. If you find it a bit too ballsy, I proposed a second test which says essentially the same thing without the testosterone. If you take this test, either of them, and are not convinced to your satisfaction, and there happens to be a judgment day, you can use this test as proof that you did your best to discover truth. You can even quote scripture at your judge. Matthew 6:33. You sought first the kingdom of God and his alleged righteousness to the best of your ability and didn't find it. If you take this test, please email me from that page and tell me so. I will put your name on that page with the date at which you began the test. So far, I have one taker who began the test in April 2014. He has not notified me of any change in his position, nor has he backed out of the test. So all the time that has elapsed from that day to this is evidence that no such God exists. Not proof, but evidence. Any theist in the world is welcome to add to that evidence. And notice that this test is an invitation, not a challenge. I have found that my imaginary friend doesn't like me throwing unprovoked spiritual challenges at people. If you take this test and start experiencing a strange amount of circumstantial adversity, but still believe there is no God to whom you are accountable, I advise you to email me back and withdraw from the test. I will not remove your name, but I will add your retraction. That too is a piece of evidence.
What's the test for?
Okay, the test is there a God to whom you are accountable? The test is God to whom...
Explain accountability?
Oh, I don't have to... Okay, I should explain accountability? Okay, if you do bad stuff, are you accountable to someone or not? If you are, then you either get rewarded or you get punished for bad stuff. If you're not accountable, you don't get punished for it.
Why can't you be accountable to yourself? Why does it have to be God?
Well, maybe we are not accountable to anyone. Maybe you are absolutely right. And maybe we die and that's all there is to it. And I can't say a thing against that. But if that's all there is, then that implies axiological nihilism, that is values nihilism. Then there is no reason to behave morally unless it just happens to feel good. And when it stops feeling good, there is no reason to behave morally.
That's an enormous conclusion to make. I feel obligation to myself, my friends, my family, and so on and so forth. I base it on a utilitarian system of values. That's not nihilism.
Utilitarian? Okay, yeah. You can choose any value system you want. But if you simply make up a value system, anyone else can make up a counter value system, and you can't say a word against that person. Hitler can make up a value system.
Sure. Well, the only problem is that you have to show that one is more likely to be true, if I can use the word true, than some others. That's what we have to do. To live on this planet, we do have to make some value judgment. And I looked around at all these different moral systems, including Christianity, which seems to have the worst value system that I can think of, and it's not even consistent. But utilitarianism, although it has its problems and its faults, seems to me to be the best. We have to, if we're going to live on this planet, we have to pick some value system. Which do you pick, or are you a nihilist?
I choose to pick one that's going to do me some good in the long run. And I don't know if there's an afterlife if there isn't. If there isn't, it doesn't matter what I pick. You know, I could just have as much fun as possible while I'm here and then die. If there is an afterlife, I want to pick a value system that's going to get me the best deal I can possibly get in the afterlife.
Well, that's what the utilitarianism is all about. The greatest good for the greatest number of people. And that includes yourself, too. But it does include other members of society and so on and so forth. Just read John Stuart Mill, and I think you find that he's pretty persuasive. At least I found it that way.
What was tag again?
Transcendental argument for God.
I'll shift gears a little bit. What can we know about God? Well, God can do anything. However, when it comes to preserving his message with clarity, well, that's apparently not important, or it was just too difficult for God. We say nothing is too difficult for God. Well, check out Judges 1. That chapter lists plenty of God's failures, including if the enemy has a certain model of chariot, God can't defeat those people. We serve a God that is unchanging, according to Psalm 102:27, Malachi 3, James 1:17. If God is unchanging, and at one time he prescribed slavery, he prescribed buying foreign slaves, he prescribed the behavior of beating the slave as being okay, provided the slave didn't die or recovered in a couple of days. And those slaves could be bequeathed to children who, in turn, could do the same thing. If God at one time felt that slavery was okay, you know, what kind of God are we serving today if he does not change? God wanted to stone homosexuals. Do you want to stone homosexuals? Are you really a believer? Or are we to say that the New Testament changed everything? Jesus came and the old law is nailed to the cross or whatever. But we have New Testament instruction. Slaves, obey your masters. Slaves, obey even harsh masters. And Paul himself sent a runaway slave back to his master instead of giving him the sanctuary that would have been prescribed in Deuteronomy, I think it is. That would be available for a runaway slave. So things hadn't changed that much. And then we have this buildup of Jesus. What can we know about Jesus? Well, things do get built up as the stories are told. And gentlemen at this table, can we agree that Mark was the first gospel written? Or the first? Is that the oldest gospel? Pastor?
You can argue that point. I mean, there are those who would agree with you.
Yeah, scholarship generally runs that way. I was really slammed on that the last time I was in this room and I spoke and mentioned that. How do you know that? Well, anyway, the scholarship is pretty intact on that, and it's taught in seminaries. So you have Mark coming first, and Mark developed some stories, and I know where a lot of those stories came from, and I'll share it with you if you want to know. But Matthew then built on the stories. A young man in Mark's story becomes an angel in Matthew's story. A stone which is already rolled away becomes a stone that the angel rolled away in Matthew's story. An earthquake was added in Matthew's story. And you know what? In Matthew 27, he even adds that there were saints being resurrected out of the ground and being seen by many in Jerusalem. Matthew had a good imagination, and he wrote a good story. Mark had written a good story. I'm saying Mark, and I'm saying Matthew. But the truth is, we don't know who wrote those books. Those are anonymous writers. Those are Greek writers writing starting maybe 40 years after the death of Jesus. So we don't know who they are. Church tradition eventually came around to certifying to the extent that it was possible that those were the writers. So we don't even know who wrote the Gospels in the Bible. Truthfully, we don't. It's the Gospel according to, well, maybe so, but these were somewhat refined Greek writers, not necessarily the kinds of guys that Aramaic speakers that were hanging out with Jesus at the time, fishermen and whatever. Okay, are we done? Oh, okay. All right. I'll stop.
Got more time?
Not to drop a microphone, it's live. We're going to go ahead and take a 5-minute break, and then when we come back, we're going to try to get a little bit more of a dialogue going just right before we do a question answer. So 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back. Helps us continue what we believe is the longest ongoing debate between Christians and atheists in the world, certainly in California, in the United States, perhaps. All right? So we're doing good things. And the good thing that we're doing is we're coming together in civility and we're having a dialogue one with another without imposing any judgment on others through the use of force, which, as I understand it, is practiced in some other places in the world. During this particular portion, we're going to take 10 minutes to have a more specific engagement between the panelists for 10 minutes. And then after that time, I want you also to be thinking of questions that you may want clarification on, and to address that to specific panelists. And we will do our best to try to keep it balanced. So before you speak during the Q&A session, if you'll just simply let me know which side you're wanting to address, that'll make sure that we can keep it alternating. So I think at this point, the debate was started by the Backyard Skeptics. So I'm going to offer this opportunity to the three panelists to pose questions to get the dialogue going between both sides. Does that make sense? So this will just be a free-form engagement of question and answers. So that's how it'll be moderated. Thank you. So Carrie, Paul, or Wayne?
Okay, I'll take the first one.
Microphone.
Oh, microphone. Pastor Mike, I agree with just about everything you said in your initial presentation, especially when you said truth is that which corresponds to reality. But then you also said Jesus is truth. How do you do that?
You have this raw material that we have to call the Scripture. In John, I quoted those two passages. One where Jesus says, I've come to testify the truth, and the other passage where says, I am the truth. And those two statements, if one of them is true, then it would mean that the other one, by necessity, also has to be true. And so I put those two together and want to see if Jesus reveals God in reality to humanity. Does that make sense?
Okay, so because the Bible says Jesus is truth, then Jesus is truth?
No. Well, that would be the lay theological acceptance of the understanding. What I want to see is how can we then go on and prove the factuality of that statement. Either he is or he is not telling us about reality.
Telling us about reality and being truth are two different things.
How so?
Well, I can tell you about reality. 2 + 2 = 4, but I am not truth.
Hence the whole Christian doctrine of an incarnate God. Yeah, I know.
Okay.
Okay, the basic line is, Christians believe that Jesus is the incarnation of the Creator. So the creeds say Jesus is God in bodily form.
Yeah.
Okay. So if Jesus is God in bodily form, he would be the truth.
If, then, you got it.
If then, exactly. So the question still remains. What I want to ask Paul, what is a coherent argument for the existence of God?
Well, he wants to know whether there's any coherent argument for the existence of God. And of course, I would deny that there is one. I don't see that there is one. And I still don't understand what it means to say God is truth. What the hell can that possibly be?
Well, if truth is reality.
Well, so God is being. That's Paul Tillich's notion of God.
Ultimate being.
Well, why on earth would anybody want to worship existence? Pure, unadulterated existence. Existence can't do anything.
It's because the
It
thought
can't
that-
answer your prayers. It can't do anything. It's just existence. Each and every one of us has it. So this makes no sense either. Now, go ahead.
If there's no coherent argument for God, then does that negate the fact that there is incoherent arguments for God? Because it seems like if
No.
I don't have the one,
No.
I can't have the other.
No. Just because you don't have one doesn't mean you can't have the other. I would agree that if none of the arguments are coherent for the existence of God, that leads you only to agnosticism. It doesn't lead you to atheism. A lot of my atheist friends make that mistake, I think. No, you need separate arguments to prove atheism, and I thought I gave a few here. In other words, if the whole concept of God is incoherent, and there are dozens of them, a couple of people in the audience here just gave me a couple of new ones here that I hadn't thought about too much before. But if God is, if the concept is incoherent, there cannot be a reality behind it, just like you cannot draw a square circle. It doesn't exist. Neither does God. So what you have to do is show me that these are not incoherent. Now, Christians have spent a lot of time, of course, trying to show that you can make consistent all of these various attributes of God, but it seems to me they fall far short. What they end up doing is rationalizing.
So how is atheism a coherent argument? Because it's...
Atheism is a negative thing. It's not a philosophy. Atheism simply means there is no God, and that they have proof of it. At least I think they have proof of it.
But what's
Not all atheists agree with me on that.
What's the proof that there is no God?
An incoherent concept cannot be real. It cannot exist in reality any more than a square circle.
So basically what it comes down to is I say there is a God and you say there's not a God.
No. You have to show me why the incoherence is not an incoherence.
And shouldn't you have to explain to me why atheism is coherent?
Atheism is not atheism
now
is
we're
not a
apples and
belief
oranges.
system. Atheism simply says there is no God.
That's a belief.
Yeah, it is a belief. And the proof... No, it's not a belief system at all.
We have
Atheists
no
are
proof of it.
Republicans, some atheists are Democrats, some atheists are even Buddhists. Atheists are all over the place. But they don't have a system. There is no atheistic system of thought. They could be anything. Some are men, some are women.
For the introverts, or actually for the extroverts in the room, I would ask that you keep your comments inside your head until you have an opportunity to step up to the microphone.
Sorry.
The reason being is because that detracts from the dialogue that we're trying to promote between the panelists who have been selected and invited to have a discussion. So, pardon for the disruption.
Cat calls and tomatoes make it more interesting.
Mike?
I might just respond to Pastor's comment. He's talking about, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And in Proverbs 8, it does show a picture of Christ being the truth in a sense. It says, it's talking about wisdom. Counsel is mine, sound wisdom and understanding. By me, kings reign, princes decree justice. It's talking about wisdom here. But then it goes, the Lord possessed me in the beginning, in the way before his works of old. Christ is a perfection, is the throughout. I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, over the earth. So here's a picture of Christ being a personified of wisdom, which would be truth. So yes, he is the truth.
Okay, Dave, is logic based on the Bible, or the Bible based on logic, or something else?
Well, I would be classified as a presuppositionalist in the sense that I see most of the leading scientists, that Kepler and various others, they looked through, Murray and others, made much of their scientific discoveries by assuming that the Bible was true and looking at the world around them through the scriptures, and that's how they were able to find things that nobody else would. In fact, most of the founders of almost every scientific discipline were Bible-believing Christians and men of science, men of God. So that's why a presuppositionalist has got a little bit of a head start. In fact, archaeologists are coming back now to the Bible to know where to look for Solomon's tomb, or we'll look for David's palace, because they're looking at what the scriptures say and they're using that to do their archaeological work. However, some things happened that took them away from that because of the higher critical scholars. Then all of a sudden now they're coming back again to look at scripture.
Kerry, if I could try to hazard an answer to your question, I would say no. The Bible is not based on logic. That the Bible is a meta-narrative that explains origin of the human situation and the attempt to redeem the situation. And there are what I consider, logic to me is if-then statements, the fallacies of logic. And so there's, I wish I had more time to work this out. But no, I don't think the Bible is based on logic. I don't think it's asking those questions or putting forth those types of arguments. So I would say no.
How about this question instead? Do you interpret the Bible by logic, or interpret logic by the Bible?
In other words, do I see the Bible as absolute truth, which therefore would dictate my responses to life?
And logic?
And logic, life and life. Well, I would hope that a rational person is going to use logic to arrive at proper conclusions.
Okay, then I think you've answered my question. You use the Bible to interpret life and logic.
Yeah.
Okay.
We've reached the 10 minutes, and you know what that means. That means this is an opportunity, if you have a question, to go ahead and come forward. And again, we will seek out a balance between both sides. David?
I want to thank the speakers for being here, although I must say that I think to some degree or another, and I say this with some jeopardy because I was one of the speakers last month, that to some degree or another I think every one of you has been engaging in incredulity, an argument by that. one other thing, Wayne, do you know who the author of that silver dollars argument is?
No.
You might be surprised to find out that his grandson and I and you were in the same room at the same time on June 17, 2014. The name of the individual is Peter Stoner, and his grandson is Donald Stoner, who is
Okay.
presented in this very form.
Okay.
You might want to ask him next time what that silver dollars argument might be from the author. And then also, I take it you're an atheist, isn't that correct, Paul? Okay.
Really?
Did I, yeah. Yes, I do. Do I understand you correctly to say something like, if there is a God, why is there evil? Is that kind of
Well,
something?
that's just one of the incoherences, because if God is all merciful and just, and incidentally, there might be an incoherence in between justice and morality, but that's a different issue. Yeah. Yeah.
If,
I don't think
suppose I take your premise that there is no God, then what would you attribute the evil to? And if so, why don't you just attribute the evil to that from that point onward?
Well, if you look at the evolutionary development of animals, you find that there's both. Some animals we would call evil, according to the human point of view, and some we would call good, and so on. You don't need a basis for that other than evolution. Man is known, and they've proved this, that he is both selfish and unselfish. Depends on what the situation is. So all you need to do is read a little bit more science. Your answer's easily, your point is easily answered. Oh, he wants to ask me.
Okay, we need to have it. Oh, so I'm staggering.
Dave, you're blocking the cameras.
Pardon? I do that a lot.
My question is for Mike. I believe you said something about, let me see, what was it? Something about 10?
Base 10.
Base 10? Could you repeat what that was? 2 + 2 = 4 in base 10?
I hope so. Is that correct?
Yeah.
That's what I think.
Yeah, it is.
Now, when
It
you
is.
use base 10, 2 + 2 always equals 4. And it's
Right.
probably around.
That's true. Now, let me ask you
Is
this.
that absolutely true?
Well, that's what I'm getting to.
Okay, I was just wondering, because to me, it seems to be, what was the argument?
That's
for no
very,
something?
that's a very
Self-evident.
That's a very reasonable statement. But let me ask you this: if I had grown up, say in the future, in a very computer-oriented family, and all I learned was base 16, what would the number? What would the today's decimal 10 be in base 16? It would be 8, would it not? So for somebody that only grew up with base 16, how would they describe base 10? Would they say base 8?
They would say form.
I think they would say base 8.
Would they not say, oh, sure. So you're
So,
saying that
so what
that
I'm
unlike
saying,
base 10?
what I'm saying is that the original statement about base 10, that itself is relative. Because if it were hexadecimal, you would actually say base 8.
Okay, comment and question. Thank you. We have another question for anybody in the panel.
Is it Paul?
Yes.
Paul, you mentioned the logical incoherencies, and you mentioned that God was non-physical.
That's right.
Okay.
At least that's what they tell us, and that's what the definition was.
Yeah. So the definition
Traditionally.
is non-physical, and then you gave a bunch of physical rationales for why that couldn't be possible, but by your own, definition, God is non-physical, and I also heard.
Incidentally, I should qualify that. If you believe in the Mormon system of belief, God does have a body. And I asked them once, where is he? And they said I was being blasphemous. That's the last I heard
I
of
actually
that.
Where's
believe.
my stone?
I actually believe God has a body also. His name is Jesus. And since I believe in an interdimensional reality that isn't only molecular and atomic, but much, much, much broader than molecular, atomic, physical structure. A God that is both omnipresent, omnipowerful, and omniscient can record information on every atom and subcomponent of anything physical in the universe. And consciousness, the non-material consciousness of God, can keep that perfectly recorded. He doesn't need a computer or a brain or some type of...
All the evidence we have is
Well-
that knowledge, it comes, or it's associated with material items. We have dozens of things like
Okay.
computers, brains, etc.
all of the
So
evidence,
if you
all
take-
of the empirical physical evidence.
That's right.
Right. But we're talking about a being who you yourself said, by definition, is not physical.
Therefore, he cannot have knowledge.
No, 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 no.
That's the conclusion you're drawing, not
Conscious,
yours.
no, 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 no. I'm just saying consciousness, okay, is not physical.
That's right.
We experience it through, molecular physical structure. So the question is, what is consciousness and how does it exist? It's a two-part question.
Anybody want to tackle that?
Yeah, okay, that's, to me, very easily. Consciousness is certainly something that is non-physical. Now, as it is for all creatures on this planet, we have two parts to existence. One is the subjective part, and the second is the object of everything outside of us. We have both in order to do this. But you cannot have consciousness without a body. That's been proven neurologically, it's been proven in everyday life, and so on and so forth. So this is an inductive argument. Unfortunately, Christians don't seem to like inductive arguments.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and go with another question from the atheist side.
Actually, I'm going to ask you gentlemen here in the end. You went on for quite some time about the eye and all the parts in the eye and all that. Now, as a Christian, your God is omniscient. He can, or omnipotent. He can do absolutely anything. I mean, that is, I want to make sure we're on the same page. So God needs to make an eye. Why can you say, okay, it's an eye, it doesn't need muscles, it doesn't need corneas, it doesn't need lenses, it just works. He has that power. If he has this power to do all of this thing, why do something so absolutely complex? I think the complexity adds to the idea that there couldn't be a God, because simplicity would make so much more logical sense. So that's my question.
Okay, that's a good question. I believe that he said we are fearfully and wonderfully made. So this is like one of the testimonies. He says his invisible power and attributes are clearly seen by the things that are made, so that they are without excuse. This is a way of God testifying the tremendous complexity of the human body is a testimony that it couldn't happen naturally. So it is a doorway or a gateway, one way that God is demonstrating who he is.
We have a question from the Christian side.
Could I respond to that?
Do we have a question for
Could
the
I
Christian
respond
side?
to that?
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to respond to that. What makes you think that just because the body is very complex, it could not have come about? Incidentally, it doesn't come about just by chance. That's just a Christian nonsense. It comes about by chance, including what has happened previous to this. It takes 3.5 billion years to get a creature like the human being. So what makes you assume that it cannot come about by chance plus what happens there? The complexity doesn't prove anything. Neither do numbers prove anything. For example, what's the probability of one person getting hit by lightning twice in his life? It's 1 in billions and billions, but nonetheless it happens. So probability is not the thing. Scientists certainly don't know all of it, granted. But saying that God did it raises more questions and more problems, like the how and the why, than any scientific explanation would give us.
We have a
So that's
question
taking
on
the wrong
Christians.
view of things.
I have a question, Dave. For the Christians, though, is that all right, or is
No, I need somebody who has a question for the atheist side. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
I keep asking atheists or agnostics or skeptics about where does your presupposition about what God's nature ought or ought not to be, seeing that every time there's a attribute or an action that is brought up by whatever religious group it is concerning the nature of God, either ontologically or the things that this deity would do or would not do, there's an objection. Well, I can't accept a God that does this or does that. If God existed, he would be this way or do that. Where do you atheists get your presupposition of the nature of deity from?
Thank you.
Let me hear again. Hope my throat holds out here. There's no presupposition here. We're simply looking at the traditional view that we have been given over the centuries by the scholastic philosophers, which they took from the Bible, incidentally, and then they elaborated on it. And we came out with these particular attributes that I mentioned from Theodore Drange here. What's the presupposition? None. This is what people believe God is. The vast majority of Christians believe this. And so I'm not sure what presuppositions are involved in that. What we have to show is that these characteristics and these attributes that God has don't make sense. And that's what I thought I had done here.
But you do have a presupposition because you're objecting to what is presented. I don't know on what basis you're objecting to God. If he wanted to have genocide, how do you come up with the conclusion that if God exists, he wouldn't commit these things? Or about the eye issue. If God existed, he wouldn't be so complex.
Because logic comes before any kinds of presuppositions. And logic tells us that these attributes cannot exist together.
Whose logic, yours or mine?
Logic is neutral. It makes no difference.
Well, what you're presenting, sir, does not make sense from a Christian perspective. So
why not?
Who gave you the right to dictate whose logic we're going to apply?
Logic is not an arbitrary thing. Everybody accepts logic. The if-then.
Then show how your
whatever kind of logic
description of the Judeo-Christian God's attributes are illogical from a universal application of the laws of logic.
Thank you.
That's a good way to summarize it.
Yes, I have a question for the sort of Christian Carrie. Carrie, please take a minute or two and describe how your version of God differs from Orthodox Christians' version of God.
I am a non-scriptural monotheist. I accept that I'm created by a God. I do not assign any attributes to that God that I am not compelled to assign to him or it by logic and by the circumstances I live in. I'm not compelled to assign to him the attribute of omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, or any of that stuff. And I definitely don't think, I definitely don't worship God, because I think that anything worthy of worship would not want to be worshipped. Is that enough?
Alrighty. Do we have any more questions, or would you like to go to the final comment stage?
I think that a good answer to the gentleman back there, cameraman, my fellow cameraman next to me, is that a good answer might have been that we use the Socratic method to look at the Christian God, just as you or any other Christian would be looking at any other God and finding the attributes of that God to be incoherent. Is that the word that you said? Okay, incoherent. So that would be what. But my question is, first a statement, Carrie, you ought to make a new religion, because what you believe is could be halfway between the atheists and theists. I think that you ought to create a new religion and call it something. You have a name for it?
Non-scriptural monotheism.
No, yeah, but I mean, you have to have a fancy name like Carrieism or something.
Definitely not. I'm not going to go there.
Okay, my question is for the theists. Dave, you said that he knows the beginning of the parade and the end parade, right? So let's say I'm walking down the street and God knows everything. So does he know the next thought that I'm going to have? Does he know the next thought I'm going to ask the question of you before I know it?
Well, the reason I say that he's above the parade is he can see the end from the beginning
Well, I'm
without
just talking
necessarily.
about the next 5 seconds. Does
Yeah.
he know the next 5 seconds of my thoughts? He
Yes.
knows everything, so.
Yes, because he's outside of time.
But if he knows the next 5 seconds, that means he knows the next 5 milliseconds. He knows the thought before I think it, right? Because the chemicals in my brain are being produced by supposedly my mind, but there's this other God that knows right before, or knew from the beginning of time, in your definition of God, that I would be having these thoughts at this particular moment. Is that correct?
Psalm 139, yes. He knows my thought afar off.
If he knows our thoughts before we think them, how in the world do we have a choice to choose a religion? If God knew from the beginning of time what I'm going to think before I think it, and the outside space and time, that has nothing to do with the question. If God knows, we have absolutely zero, zada, zilch, free will. Zada, I just made up that word, by the way.
No, that's not true at all. But basically what he says here is, thou knowest my downsitting, my uprising, thou understandest my thought afar off, thou compassest me.
I don't think that answers my question.
No, but what I'm saying is...
Can you just say it in English?
Yeah, I'm just telling you that's what he says, so I want to make sure. So he is able to... It doesn't mean that he's causing anything to happen. That's
He's
the
not
difference.
causing it.
He's not causing
But he knows it's going to happen.
You're talking about Calvinism, so you're mistaken. A Calvinist will normally say that God doesn't know anything that he does not ordain. But I'm not a Calvinist. What I'm saying is that God knows the end from the beginning, which is what the Scripture says.
Yes, but you
But
can't
he
get away
doesn't
from
have
my...
to cause it to
I'm
happen
trying to be
because
polite
he's
here.
outside of time.
That doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, that's because
if I'm God, and I know the thought before you were going to even think it, because I know the chemicals in your brain and every atom and molecule and protein in your brain, you have no choice but to think that thought.
No, that's not true at all. You're totally misunderstanding this.
I am, because I don't know your statement when it says he's outside space and time.
Use your brain.
I'm trying.
Try. Okay, you're above the parade. Okay, you see the first float. You see the end float. Okay, you see these two floats. You're not causing those floats to move. You're outside of the
Okay.
time.
The question is becoming argumentative, and you would have the freedom to sit on a panel for a debate and a dialogue. So I'm just going to exercise the control to be able to...
You're not causing the floats to do anything. You're just observing them. That's what God is doing.
If anybody attends any of the debates that are offered here and think that in a matter of hours, some of the questions that have persisted for millennia are going to be answered in a single fraction of a moment in time, and again, the expectation is very unrealistic. But for that reason, we're going to accept one more question, then we're going to go to closing comments, because we have a time limitation of 9:30, Bruce, so we're really close to that. Okay?
Well, I was going to just comment on Bruce's.
That's fine.
God's ways are above our ways, beyond our, tracing out. He knows all. So you're not God, so, like I don't know how God does it, but God knows all things. And he doesn't, just because you can do what you want, he doesn't influence you, but he knows what you're going to do because he sees the end from the beginning. I mean, so he knows what you're going to do. He knows he created you. He created your brain fizz, as you called it last week.
Before we have no free will.
Lots more wonderful things to be discussed for sure. We're going to go ahead and go with a 5-minute limitation on each speaker. That's going to push us over our limit, but we can balance back and forth. So because there's a odd number on this side, I'm going to ask Paul if you'll go first, then Mike, then Terry, then David, and then Wayne. You can conclude with the last 5 minutes. Use them in their entirety, but I will give you a marking when we get close.
So this is just a summation of what we talked about here. Well, let me just comment on the last discussion that Bruce brought up here. And I think Bruce has got a very good point. To say that God wasn't the cause of it means that God does not cause what goes on in the world. If God does not cause what goes on in the world, he certainly couldn't be the creator. So you have an inconsistency right there. It seems to me it's impossible to get out of that quagmire that was mentioned by Bruce. But my argument all evening simply has been this idea of incoherence. And to try to argue that my logic is different from somebody else's logic is just nonsense. Logic is neutral. Christians use it just as much as non-Christians or atheists or anybody else. So you can't get around it by that kind of ruse here. So I think if you look at the situation and you stick to the definition that most Christians believe, which is the traditional definition of God, which I mentioned at the very beginning, and incidentally, that's the only kind of God I'm trying to show doesn't exist. I don't know about my fellow atheist Carrie's view of God. That would take us into a different kind of argument and so on and so forth. But it sounds interesting. I'd love to know more about it. But my only point is that this traditional notion of God is simply incoherent. And simply, logically speaking, incoherent objects cannot exist any more than a square triangle can. And if you don't accept that, you're illogical. And that's all I can say on that particular point. Now, you may disagree with the incoherence, and that some of these have been argued, of course, for a long time, like the problem of evil and suffering. Christians have a good answer, and one was mentioned here tonight, namely the one that God has his own. God only knows, is usually the phrase, God only knows why he allows a man to strangle his wife, or why the Holocaust existed. But of course that's just a cop-out to simply say God was, because there's no way to refute that specifically, except to say that if that's the case, then whatever God has intended, or whatever God allows is a better word, if God allows these atrocities in the world, then it must have been a good thing. Where does Christian morality get out of that? Christian morality says no, there are evils and sins in the world. If there are evil and sin in the world, then whatever God has done or allowed must be good. So the man strangled his wife for a good reason. The Holocaust occurred for good reasons. Maybe to lower the population rate, something like that. I don't know. But it certainly is, it ruins man's system of morality. How can you be moral if everything that happens is for the greater good? I don't see how they can get out of that. That is, to me, that's a point that simply cannot. And about God having a free will, well, of course, God cannot have a free will. That's incoherent as well. In order to have a free will, you cannot know ahead of time what it is you're going to decide. But if God knows everything, he knows what he's going to decide. So he doesn't decide. Where's the free will? It's gone. I could list hundreds of different incoherences in this nonsensical idea of a God. And that's why I don't believe in it. Simple as that. But I'll let somebody else rant and rave here other than me.
We'll go ahead and pass on to Mike.
One of my underlying arguments tonight was that many of the arguments that we raise, both for and against the existence of God, the truth of the Christian revelation, are offered up to us at a lay level of understanding, which invites huge errors and incoherences. And what I'm saying, what I believe, is that at higher levels of expertise, these supposed incoherences and inconsistencies are well understood. Many of the arguments I've heard tonight against the position that there is a God, or how we determine what is true or not, are at that level. I think, Carrie, you mentioned, well, this understanding's for the kids, but then later this one's for the adults. And I'm fearful that many of us, and may I say, most Christians, are at that child level. And so they speak childish things that do not match with reality. But when we grow up in the things that we studied and come to tackle logically, I think those things become non-questions. For me, Bruce's question is a nonsense question. The question of the attributes of God being incoherent is nonsense. The question that God, I totally agree with Paul. If God knows everything, then he doesn't have any free will because he's got to do what he's got to do. He already knows it, which is just, that's nuts. So we have to have a different picture of how things in reality actually are. But we're so clouded with misinformation that we have been taught. I mean, Wayne and David are both pulling scriptures out of context and saying, this is truth, because God's word is infallible and it can't change. And so if this portion says, what'd you say, Wayne, about Judges? Oh my goodness, I forgot.
Defeat the iron chariots.
But then he can't, right? What was raised?
No,
Gosh, I wish I wrote it down.
Okay, well, my point was that we say that God can do anything, but Judges says that's not true because there are a
seems
whole
like
list,
a total
whole list of
logical
failures.
inconsistency, right?
Right.
Yeah. And what I want to say, at a higher level of understanding and expertise, that can make sense. But it doesn't make sense to the layperson. And most people, theists and Christians, are still lay people in their field. And so a lot of their arguments don't make sense.
Our time, I'm going to go to Carrie, or Wayne, you can decide.
So therefore, we should all trust the experts.
No, we should all do our own homework.
No, this is just concluding marks with each person. So, Carrie, did you want to take 3 to 5 minutes to finally state your summation?
Test all things, including the document that tells you to test all things. And if you don't test those things by logic, by what can you possibly test them?
David, he's passing his time. You want to go ahead and use your 5 minutes for summation? Then it'll go to Wayne.
Okay, well, we look at the Egyptian flight that Wayne brought up in Matthew 2:15. Yes, it does talk about a picture of Israel out of Egypt I will call my son. That was a predictive prophecy as well as a historical event. So there's nothing wrong with that. A lot of times the Bible does use that. It's like a dual fulfillment. We look at the part about Herod's slaughter, and he's right. I mean, Jeremiah, he does talk about the captivity, Babylonian captivity. It is referring to that, but it's also referring to the picture that happened at the slaughter of the boys around in Bethlehem as well. Because these things, if you interpret Scripture, you have to see that a lot of times they'll make an allusion to an Old Testament event to look at a future thing. That's not a problem. And in Nazareth, it's true that there was no town at Nazareth at the time it was written, but Nazareth was considered, will any good thing come out of Nazareth? It was a picture of who Jesus was. He was called a Nazarene. That doesn't mean somebody who is from Nazareth necessarily, even though Jesus lived in Nazareth, but it means somebody who is despised and rejected of men. It was a picture. It was more of an adjectival description. And we look at, this. I mean, we can look at all of these passages, and they're not difficult to understand at all if you look at them closely. And you're a very intelligent man. You should know this. You've looked at them before. But you're trying to make inconsistencies for no reason at all that I see. And there was something else that came up with as far as time is concerned. Given enough time, anything can happen. Time becomes the magic wand to turn the frog into a prince, amoeba to man, particle to people. But time's arrow goes the wrong direction. Everything in observable space and observable time entropy increases, measure of disorder increases. Things are not getting more complex. We're receiving higher and higher genetic loads. That's why we have to be very careful who we marry. Can't be a brother or sister or cousin, first cousin. Because of the genetic load, things are going downhill. We're not evolving higher. Nobody has ever seen a mutation cause an increase in information. Sometimes mutation can keep an animal from dying because it doesn't produce the protein that kills it, but it's always a loss of information every single time.
I've heard that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Well, why did 99.9% of all species that God has ever made gone extinct? It's true. We're fearfully and wonderfully made. God apparently doesn't know how many teeth fit into our mouths. Have any of you ever had to have wisdom tooth surgery? Well, you'll know that's true. We're fearfully and wonderfully made. We seem to have the remnants of something. If you look in the corner of your eyes, you'll see the remnants of what's known as a nictitating membrane. It's that translucent additional eyelid that you'll find on some reptiles, and polar bears happen to have them. This, apparently, God wanted us to have this so it would look as though we went through a process of evolution. If you went to a building department and you said, I have a wonderful idea. I'm going to build this wonderful home, and the engineer looks it over with you, and he finds fault with the plumbing. And you say, no, I have this pipe I'm going to use. I'm going to push gas through it. I'm going to, at times, have gas come back out of it. I'm going to push water through it, and on rare occasion, water's going to have to come back out. And I'm going to force food through this pipe. And the engineer then denies your plan, and after you leave the planning counter, there's laughter in the back room. This guy is nuts. Well, this is what we have. This is our pharynx. We have this delicate balance in there that if there's the slightest miscue, we choke. The next time you're choking, just thank God for your pharynx. Thank God that He designed it that way. The slightest miscue between breathing and swallowing, just that one mistake and you're in trouble. This is being fearfully and wonderfully made. How about, Dave, do you have nipples? Now, why does a man have nipples? This is fearfully and wonderfully made. We have papillae on our skin, these little tiny muscles that would hold hair out. It works for a cat. A house cat, can become big all of a sudden to ward off an enemy. It doesn't work for us. These are just vestigial things that we have, components of our bodies. There was a creation story. There have been many thousands. The Potawatomi Indians up in the Wisconsin area, before they got pushed around by the white man, but they had this creation story. There was the Earth Maker. The Earth Maker created the earth and all that is in it. He also decided, well, there's no man here, so at a stream bed, he fashioned a hearth, and then he made a clay man. He baked this man, put life into him, and realized, oh, he didn't bake it long enough. It's the white man. And so the next time, he was going to be more careful, and his man, well, it didn't turn out well because he fell asleep, took a little nap, and it became the black man, and that didn't suit him either. And finally, he paid careful attention, and sure enough, breathed life into him, and there was the red man. So he had accomplished what he wanted to do. Well, we don't believe that. We think it's silly. But our religion comes to us. How much time do I have? Oh, okay. Okay. I'm over. I've got some good stories. Let's do this again sometime.
Alrighty, I think the panelists deserve a hand. Did you want to make an announcement, Bruce, about are your people going to Norms afterwards? If you want to carry this conversation on, you can go to Norms. Thank you for coming. We appreciate it. The next one will be the 19th of November.
Third straight November 19th.
I didn't set the earth in motion, so.